Okay, so here we are going to I'm going to go over the 5 key global environmental indicators that we finished up with in the previous video. So this is in Friedland Chapter 1, and we are on 1.3, going in detail about the global indicators. Okay, so the first global indicator is biological diversity. So biological diversity, also known as biodiversity, is basically having diverse life forms in the environment. So there are 3 levels: genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Okay. So diversity in life can affect a lot of ecosystems, and when it is basically destroyed through human impacts or pollution or just lack of resources, then it can weaken the ecosystem. Okay, so genetic diversity is having different gene variation among individuals in a population. So for example, if there's a disease and for some reason like one, genetic trait was more resistant to the disease than other ones, then at least part of the population or part of the species would survive. However, if there is little genetic diversity, then all of the species and all of the population would die or get destroyed through the disease. Next is species diversity. So it's having a limited or diverse number of species in a habitat, right? So either there's a lot of diversity or there is little. And so this also can have an impact because if there is limited diversity, then if one species dies out, then that can basically take a step out of the food chain, okay? And so kind of just destroy, which can have an impact on other species. Okay, so however, if there are several species or a diverse number of species in the ecosystem or habitat, then there are other food sources, or there can be other ones that will carry out different ecosystem services in that area. Okay, so you can see just some background and data about the number of species on Earth. And the number of species is declining based on scientific data. Speciation is the evolution of new species. However, this does take a very long time. Whereas, there are 10,000 species going extinct every year, but to develop them, for that new species to evolve does not match up with that rate. And habitat destruction and habitat degradation, are the main causes of species extinction. And so, however, other environmental issues do also affect species loss. Okay, so going on to ecosystem diversity. So that is how many ecosystems exist in a given region. So here in Southern California, we don't have too much diversity, but if you go to areas like NorCal, we have a lot of different types of ecosystems and biomes within a small area. Okay, so here, as you see, we have the 3 triangles. So I want you guys to make sure that you are aware about how to convert between hectares and acres. Okay, so the calculations are below. So one hectare is equal to 2.47 acres, or we can say 1 acre is 0.4 hectares. So either conversion is fine in this case. Okay, 1.32, food production. So obviously we need to eat to survive. And then hence why that's one of our 5 global indicators. So just being able to survive and grow food to support the whole human population is important to maintain on Earth. So with that, healthy soil is really important. So we're going to talk about soil in a later chapter, but yeah, just not just like, oh, we have to produce more food. We also have to be cautious about the nutrients in the soil, and also just so the soil can continue to sustain crops. Because that affects the amount of crops that can be grown and harvested. All right, so take a look at this graph. So this is a graph of the worldwide grain production per person per year. So since 1950, it has increased. However, in recent years, this book was written in 2011, in recent years it has not increased, and actually it's less than 1980s, even though the population was smaller back then. And so a interesting and slightly alarming, some slightly alarming data. So side note, when it says per capita, that means per person. Okay, so we will need to be aware of the human population, but we will talk about that in a few minutes. All right, so that is, yeah, human, so food production, we're increasing the population, but the amount of grain being produced is not increasing. So there are also other factors that have to go that impact how much grain is produced. So if you talk about climate, land, human labor, energy, etc. And also sometimes the government or certain areas, they will limit how much crops can be grown, or there's like soil degradation. So there's lots of factors that have to go that affect like how much grain can actually be produced in some areas. They also are starting to use crops like corn for making fuel like ethanol. So that's also another controversial issue when we're taking grain and using it instead to burning it basically to make fuel. Okay, so in the past, humans have changed the way that they harvested and grew things to basically produce more food. However, that also had an impact on the soil. So as scientists are just being more aware of these issues, and just understanding soil degradation and how much it can sustain, then also affects how much food we can produce. So there definitely have to be some changes for food production. Okay, the third key indicator is average global surface temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations. Okay, so this can lead to some other environmental issues, but yeah, specifically look at the global surface temperature and carbon dioxide concentrations. Okay, so there's something called greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases trap heat. So we'll look at a graphic in the next page. And so one of the most common greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide, CO2. So when you're answering questions like FRQs or looking at your multiple choice, you want to think specifically about greenhouse gases. Okay? And then specifically state CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Okay, so graphic that I want you guys to know here. Okay, so you can see on the left side we have a drawing of how greenhouse gases work. So the blue circle is the atmosphere, and we need the atmosphere because it protects us from the sun. So solar energy comes in, hits Earth, reflects back. However, the greenhouse gas will prevent the heat from leaving the Earth. Okay, so we do need the gases in the atmosphere. However, certain ones will prevent the heat from leaving, and so just the heat gets trapped. It's like a big blanket. And so that is the greenhouse gases. On the right side, you can see the temperatures, the global temperature, and the relationship to the amount of carbon dioxide. Okay, and scientists do believe that we are the main cause of increased CO2. So it's anthropogenic, so it's caused by our activities, which is definitely a possibility, right? So from factories, cars, and then just producing more products, right? And transporting things, so just a lot of CO2 is produced. Okay. Also, we are destroying plants through deforestation, habitat destruction. So those plants would normally convert CO2 into oxygen. However, because we are destroying those plants, then they're not converting it at the same rate. However, that is not the most significant, like destroying habitats and forests is not the most significant impact or most significant contribution towards producing more CO2, but it is definitely a factor. Okay, 1.34 human population. So our population is growing. So as of last census, which is 2019-2020, there are approximately 7.6 billion people. And so I think the numbers I saw were from 2019. But yeah, so we've already grown by 0.8 billion, and that's a lot of people. And so you need to keep in mind, and need to be like, before the AP test, make sure we know the current world population. Okay, and then the fifth key indicator is resource depletion. So this is looking at the natural resources, renewable and non-renewable resources, and how they are used. So yeah, so just using resources, we obviously need resources to live. However, how we use them can affect the environment negatively. So some negative negative consequences of just using resources and getting them from ecosystems, so pollution, land degradation, waste, air pollution, etc. So those are some negative consequences. And again, with pollution, there are different kinds. So soil, water, air, light, sound. So these can all affect the environment and drive out animals or cause bacteria like the hysteria that we read about at the beginning of this chapter. So there are natural resources. So some of them are renewable. Okay, sorry. So some of them are non-renewable. So in here we can see that coal, iron, and uranium are non-renewable. So non-renewable resource means that, sorry about that. So yeah, non-renewable resources cannot be renewed. So when we run out of that resource, we will not have any more. So other ones can be recycled, hence why recycling is really important. And then there are renewable resources such as trees and lumber. So you can keep growing them and harvesting them and then growing some more. However, it does have to still be grown. You have to grow enough of that resource to basically keep supplying them. Okay, so here is a little math practice about resources. And just an interesting side note, so the way that you present information can have a different impact. So sometimes it can sound more dramatic just based on how you present the data. Okay, so it's all the same, but it can just, just kind of have a different emotional impact. Right, and then resource per capita. So per capita is per person. Okay, so development. So you've probably heard the term developed nation or developing nations. You might also hear first world or third world, but we are going to use developed and developing nations in mix. Okay, so development is improving human well-being through economic advancement. So such as having a car, eating meat, okay, having technology. So those are all examples of developed or high development. So developed nations are the US, Canada, Australia, Europe, Japan. So those are all developed nations. And so again, developed versus developing. These developing nations do not have a lot of the things that we do, such as cars, meat, technology. But the developed nations, again, are these ones listed. However, most developed nations, even though they're only 20% of the world, they use the most resources. So it's kind of, is that ethical? Is that correct? And then see this graphic here. Okay, so just looking at the data. So yeah, just looking at how we use resources. So again, those are the 5 key indicators of how well we're doing as a world. So biological diversity, food production, average global surface temperature and CO2 concentrations, human population, and resource depletion. And so be familiar with those 5 indicators and just be able to give some examples of each.